Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Vicom's webinar that we're hosting with Comprise titled, Take Control of Your Cold Data, Save Big on Storage Costs. It's an intriguing and powerful title and what we are going to talk about today. And please note that we will be recording the webinar today. My name is Andy Jonak, and I'm Director of Marketing for Vicom Computer Services, and I will be hosting today. Vicom is a full-service multi-cloud infrastructure provider with a 3-decade history of helping our customers drive business innovation through advanced IT solutions, services, and support offerings. Our domains of expertise include IT infrastructure, multi-cloud solutions, networking, operations and service management, security, staff augmentation, and professional and managed services. And that very much includes solutions to help organizations grow, manage, and maintain their storage environments, and includes offerings from organizations such as Comprise. So let's do introductions for today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Lana Rosenzweig with Comprise, who's the Sales Director for the Northeast. Lana is our featured speaker today, and we're happy to have her join us. So we hope that you find the webinar and information presented today to be intriguing and, most importantly, useful, as what we're discussing today is something we see as very significant to the organizations we work with, how to manage cold and unused data so you can manage to more efficient storage environments. So some logistics about today. The webinar is 1 hour total, and as I mentioned, we will be recording the session. Our presentations will probably take 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll leave time at the end of the presentation for questions. But if you do have questions throughout the webinar, we will stop a couple times throughout the presentation to give people the opportunity to be able to ask questions. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, but as I mentioned, we will unmute at the end of the presentation and through specific times to give people the ability to ask those questions. So with that said, thank you again for joining us today, and let's get going. So IT environments today are increasingly complex. We all know it, we all live and breathe it every day, especially in what we've all chosen to do for a living. We have environments that are on-prem, cloud, or a combination thereof, multi-cloud environments. But because of the complexity of our environments today and where our storage and, most importantly, our data sits, how can we be sure that we are operating and managing it efficiently? Storage and data growth continue to be challenges for firms today, and this trend will, of course, continue, as we all know. Data is growing rapidly, more than doubling every 2 years, and legacy approaches to addressing storage are increasingly bringing challenges. IDC recently predicts that the sum of all the world's data will grow to 163 zettabytes by 2025, a staggering number. Because of this growth, firms are continually spending more and more on their storage environments out of necessity. A consequence of this data growth is managing the type of data that you have. Which data is hot, which data is cold. Hot data needs to be readily available on high-performance storage, while cold data can be moved to cheaper storage, which can provide for significant cost savings. For this to be an effective strategy, this moving of data needs to happen automatically. And you need to have the ability to be able to do this no matter where your data sits, multi-cloud or on-premise. This is where Vicom and Comprise can help, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn it over to Lana Rosenzweig with Comprise, who's going to talk about some of these challenges and introduce you to the Comprise solutions, how their solutions help firms, and also give you a bit of a demo on what the solution looks like. So Lana, now I'm going to go ahead and turn control over to you. Lana, I now have you unmuted, and I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter. Okay. Lana, you should have the ball.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Terrific. Okay, so let me share my screen, and please let me know when that becomes available.
Okay, looks good. Looks like we can see it.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you everyone for joining. As Andy said, I am the Director of Sales for the Northeast. I've been with Comprise for about 2 years, and overall have spent over 20 years selling storage, whether it's backup, tape, or or disk-based devices. So I found Comprise to be a very unique solution when I joined them, and we're going to talk a little bit about specifics of what Comprise helps customers do today in data management, as well as show you guys a little bit of a demo of what the product looks like. So by all means, please feel free to ask questions. As Andy said, we could stop a couple of times and take some questions. So what do we see out there today in terms of managing data, and what are we really talking about? Well, first off, we're specifically talking about unstructured data. So that's the world that Comprise really lives is in the unstructured data world. One of the reasons is that we consider block-based data to really be more active. It's also a much smaller percentage of overall data that's out in the world today. But the biggest problems that our customers face are that data is trapped in silos. So for large financial customers, insurance customers, healthcare customers that we typically work with, they have the issue of not being able to really delete any data. So therefore, the data just continues to grow and continues to be backed up and continues to be replicated, but it's kind of trapped in these silos without any visibility. So the first problem that customers really face is if I even want to implement any kind of an archival system in my environment, where do I start, right? And that's that visibility portion. The second issue that customers face when talking about, again, archival or management of data is how do I do this without disruption to my end user? So do I move data to a lower tier? Do I move it to the cloud? But then what happens when the user actually does go in those rare instances and tries to find that data? I want no user disruption in the way that my users work. And then the third challenge is how complex is this solution to implement? How costly will this be? If it's too costly, if the environment, if my current environment, would it be less expensive to just grow my current storage tier than to implement a third-party solution that now helps me manage it? So those are the three issues that we help solve. So what are we actually doing? We're transforming the data management by addressing key customer issues. So we're taking those issues and we're solving them. Now, again, the piece of the pie that we're interested in is in that 76%. It's really more 80-20. We've all heard that 80-20 rule of most data being hot for a very short period of time and then very quickly moving into very low access or never to be accessed again. So the issues that we're solving is, again, that having that visibility into unstructured data. So if your organization is ready to do something about that cold data, you want to know where to start, right? So I don't want to just start moving things based on age, perhaps. Maybe I want to have a little more understanding of what type of files am I storing, who owns them, et cetera. How do I address the actual data growth that's happening in my environment? So it's not enough to just move the cold data that I have. It's also very important to be able to control the data as it's coming in. So I need to be able to obviously address that as well. We talked about the user disruption. So I don't want to have any disruption in my environment when I move data, when I move cold data to a lower tier. And the last one is most of the customers we're talking to today either have some form of cloud initiative going on now, but are certainly looking to the cloud potentially in the future. So one of the things that Comprise makes it very easy for customers to do is to move to the cloud eventually without, again, changing a lot of the things that they're doing in their environment today. So make it a simple migration without any user disruption. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So with that, let's talk about the three pillars that make our solution unique. So in our essence, we are an archival tool. We give you ability to look at the data. We are completely agnostic in terms of what we can read from and what we can move data to, allowing you to really mount almost any shares in your environment and get some very quick data growth analytics on them. We obviously give you the transparent move technology that I've been alluding to that is completely non-disruptive, that allows you to move cold data that's been identified to a lower tier. So again, really think of it as anything in your environment today, potentially lower tiers that can be brought in, such as private cloud object storage devices or the cloud itself. And then, of course, the last pillar is data access anywhere. So what that means is that because the product tries to be extremely non-proprietary and agnostic, we are very big on allowing customers to access their data anywhere. And what we mean by that is not heavily relying on Comprise to get to that data, meaning if we move it to an S3 bucket, we want to make that data accessible even without Comprise. And that's actually a very big point with a lot of our larger customers, is ability to get to their data even after the move without having to be reliant on the Comprise solution. And we'll talk about each one of these pillars in a little bit more detail. So I'll stop here really quick before we start going a little bit deeper into any of these three pillars and see if there's any questions right now.
I've gone ahead and unmuted everyone, Lana, so give everybody a second to respond. Okay. Any questions from anyone on anything that Lana had presented so far? If not, we're going to go ahead and mute everybody again. Okay.
Okay. That sounds good. So let's talk about some of the technical differentiators that Comprise solution brings to the table. So the first one, as I mentioned, is the fact that we're agnostic. So we don't really specify the platforms with which we work. It's really more about the protocols. So we can connect to any storage share via NFS, CIFS, or SMB. We don't require any storage agents. We don't require any hardware to be loaded in the customer environment. And one of the big differentiators for how our product is architected is the fact that we don't sit in the hot data path. So we don't actually sit between the user and the application and the NAS. We sit off to the side and mount the shares, scan them, and then move data from them to a lower tier target. Another big differentiator for us is that when we move the data, we leave behind a dynamic link. And a dynamic link is basically a symbolic link, for those who are familiar with that construct, that are supported within the protocol within which we're working. So it's either NFS, CIFS, or SMB. So this is a big difference between using something like a static stub, which some of the other archival engines out there do, which points directly at the data. Symbolic links are more portable, they're lighter, they're easier to work with, and they can be treated as files. As I mentioned before, the system is stateless. It creates no bottlenecks in terms of performance, and it moves files to a lower tier, whether that, again, be another NAS share internally, or whether it's the cloud, or whether it's an S3 gateway. We do that and continue to have access to that data regardless of what that target is. Another feature that Comprise brings to the table is migration of data. So it's an all-inclusive model that gives you all of our capabilities. Our licensing is based on the upfront capacity which we address, and everything that the product can do with your data on the back end is included. So migration of data is something that we see a lot of our customers doing internally, one NFS target to another. So this could be consolidation of Windows file servers. This could be retirement of an older NAS device. But we find that there's a lot of movement from source to source. And one of the benefits of using Comprise is that if we have already archived some of the data on that original source and we move it now to a new source, those links will go with those links will continue to work on the new source. So this is a really, really nice and easy solution. And then I've mentioned a couple of times this native access to data in S3. So when we write data to an S3 bucket, we don't chunk it. we continue using it in a native access, meaning a one-to-one relationship from file to object, which is what allows our customers to be able to get to it in that S3 bucket without having to rehydrate it first. Okay, so let's quickly look at the architecture of the product. So Comprise is essentially a supercompute grid that rolls out as a series of VMs in your environment. These VMs are specifically designed, again, to scan your environment, but also to move data from NFS and SMB shares. We can support a multitude of targets on the back end, so you could have certain types of data being written to one target while other types of data being written to another target. We also have a Comprise Director, which is our administrative console. This is the piece that I'll be demoing for you at the end of the presentation. And as you can see here, Comprise does not sit between the applications and the end users and the NAS. So therefore, our scans are done in a very non-intrusive way, and all the movement of data is done behind the scenes. So as far as the users are concerned, nothing really changes in their environment while Comprise is running. Okay, so this would probably be another good place to stop really quick and see if there's any questions from the audience.
Okay, gone ahead and unmuted everyone. Anybody have any questions they'd like to address? Okay.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and mute everybody. And,
we'll keep going. Alrighty, so let's talk about the three pillars. So the first one is this data growth analytics, right? So what are we going to show you when we've completed a scan of your environment? Comprise is going to come back in this really easy format, give you a very quick snapshot on what the environment looks like. So first thing we're going to do is really draw out the data that we've gathered and what we've looked at, and show you by age. And we look at the last access field as our determinant of how old the data is, of what the data looks like. We'll also be able to capture some cost savings. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, on the left side of the screen, we'll be able to set up a plan by which we will move the data to a desired target. So in addition to just capturing this quick snapshot of data, we'll also be able to go a little bit deeper and show you what types of files are being stored, who are the top groups, top shares, top owners. The product integrates with Active Directory. So there's quite a bit of information that we'll be able to show you from that initial scan, as well as things like how quickly is my data growing, and what will happen if I initiate this plan of moving data, and how much will that slow my growth down. So all of this information is available in just a basic plan analysis. We can go a little bit deeper with our product called Deep Analytics and actually run specific reports, for instance, on data that's not owned by anyone. So we call that our zombie data report, or specific searches for very specific file extensions, size of files, maybe data belonging to a specific user. So on the analysis part, the product is very strong. Again, analytics run very quickly. So a typical scan will take anywhere from a couple of days to possibly a week, and we're talking about multi-petabyte environments. So the speed of scan for us is anywhere between 5 and 10 million files per hour per observer. And again, remember the grid is what the observers live in, and you can have as many observers set up as you need for the size of your environment. Okay, I mentioned cost modeling and ability to kind of show some of the savings that are as they're happening. So when we initiate a plan, the product will actually go out and create this orange line. This orange line is what's showing us as data that's targeted for the move. So this is what we've actually identified as potential data that can be moved to a target. What we can also do is ask you for some basic costs in your existing storage environment. So things like, what is your tier 1 cost of data is storage now? How much is your backup hardware, software? How many numbers of copies are you keeping? And then, of course, put in the costs for the proposed target. So whether it's a cloud target, on-prem target. So based on these numbers, we're able to then calculate what the cost savings will look like if we're able to move again, the data that's identified in this orange circle, meaning how much capacity will we free, how much backup will be reduced, and of course, what does that equate to in dollars. So very useful tools, again, for keeping track of how the product is actually behaving and what kind of benefits you're getting from it. Okay. Moving on to the next tier of this transparent move technology. So again, essentially what Comprise will do is once those files are identified is pick up and move files to a target and leave behind a symbolic link. The symbolic link looks the same to the end user as the file did. So from their perspective, this is a completely transparent move. Since we're not in the hot data path, again, we don't slow down the performance at all. We don't require anything to be loaded at the client end. And as far as they're concerned, again, the file is still there. So this is searchable. This will appear in their directories. And if it's clicked, this file will actually open up. So a very, very simple system. Moving on to the last pillar, this data management anywhere. As I mentioned before, we do give you the ability to really get to your data in your tier 1 as well as the proposed targets. So wherever you move your data, Comprise will be able to support it. So if your plans change in the next few years as far as where you're going to be writing your data to, or even what primary NAS you're going to be living on, Comprise has tools to assist you with migration, archival, copying of data, and then, of course, give you access to any of that data wherever it may live. Okay, so let's just look at some of the partners that we work with. So again, because we're completely agnostic and really support protocols rather than platforms, this gives us the ability to integrate with many, many different partners, both on the tier 1 NAS side, where a majority of our customers are using NetApp or EMC Isilon products. But then on the back end, of course, we integrate with a variety of cloud providers, as well as object filer manufacturers, and even some tape manufacturers that have an S3 ability for us to communicate via S3. So quite a bit of a selection there. Some of the use cases that we address, again, of course, capacity planning. So customers who are just drowning in data and paying quite a bit to store cold data, we really address that use case. Archival, that's probably our biggest use case. Replication and data recovery, so we do have the ability to copy data as well as archive it. So in a lot of our customer cases, they'll actually archive to one target while continually copying data to another target. We talked about data migration. This is also available as a standalone product for Comprise, so just moving data from one NFS source to another, one SMB source to another can be purchased as a standalone license. And then, of course, the ability to access data when it's moved to object without the use of Comprise. So this is a big differentiator for us. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of case studies before jumping into the demo. Again, I just want to stop really quick and see if there's any questions on anything that I've covered so far.
Okay, I've gone ahead and unmuted everyone. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to address them. We got a couple of questions coming through on the chat.
Oh, good.
But we'll wait those. We'll address those towards the end, kind of in the Q&A section. Okay.
Sounds good. All righty. So I'll move on then. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So this is a large insurance company based here in New York, and again, as with many insurance companies, there really is a very little data retention, meaning everything gets kept for a very long time. So as data gets accumulated, again, it continues to live on very expensive storage. There's petabytes of it. The data is continually replicated and backed up. And one of the big issues this customer was having, they really didn't know how much of that data was cold. So there was really no automation in place to handle it. So the benefits that Comprise brought to this customer is identifying that 65% of their data was older than 1 year and was subject to a potential archival move. We translated this to about $6.9 million in savings. So when they started archiving their data by policy, they started moving it from Isilon, in their case, to IBM CleverSafe solution. And again, extremely happy. This was a customer also that we specifically delivered that zombie data report that I mentioned earlier, which showed them that about 15% of the data being stored on their Isilon simply was orphan data. So it was created by employees that no longer work there. So again, was candidate for the archival move. So very, very successful implementation. The next customer I'm going to talk about is Boone County. Their issue was more on the growing problem of body and dash cam footage that they were storing. Again, they didn't have great retention around it, so they were very long and they were mandated to keep the data accessible. So they didn't want to disrupt the users by going offline or migrating data because, again, they never knew when that data would be needed, when that footage would be needed. So they wanted to have easy access to it. So in their case, we were able to cut storage costs by about 70% while addressing the data growth that was occurring in their environment as well. They were not using an on-prem target. They decided to move their data to Azure Blob. And, of course, that was done, again, behind the scenes with zero disruptions to users. So another very happy customer. And what our product also enabled them to do was address the hot data needs by going out and purchasing a flash-based system that would work for the hot data, which obviously needs to sit on or should sit on faster moving storage like flash. Okay, so I'm going to switch into the demo, which will be pretty quick. But while I'm doing that, if you want to unmute everyone, Andy, and I'll be happy to, again, take any questions that come up.
Okay. Everybody's unmuted. Does anybody have any questions, Aplana?
Okay, so I'll take you through. This should look familiar based on what I had already shown you through the screenshots, except this is a live demo. So as I mentioned, this green donut is created after the initial scan, and it breaks out all the data that we're looking at on your NAS by age. So with the darkest colors being the freshest data, the lighter colors becoming older data. We also can break out the usage tab and look at the data, again, using the same characteristics of age, so we're consistent in displaying it, but now we're breaking it into the types of data that we're seeing in your environment, file size of data, owners, top groups, and top directories. So all of these reports are exportable, and you can get a full report as an Excel spreadsheet if you wanted to that has all of this information. Looking over on the left side of the screen is where, again, we have our plan. So this is where we're going to actually determine our data policy. So first thing I want to show you is that you could set up different groups. So different groups can address different types of storage. We work very well in environments where customers have different types of NASs. So you may have one group that's looking at just the NetApp storage, and another one potentially looking maybe at the HNAS or something like VNX, and of course different types of data. But if we look at the policies that we've set up here, we can play around with these numbers before we do anything in terms of actually moving this data. So right now, my plan is set to look at data that's over 3 years old. If I want to get a little more aggressive with it and now point it to data that's over 1 year old, you see that this view changes and that orange line becomes larger. So we're now looking at a larger data set that is potentially targeted for that move. In addition to moving data, as I mentioned before, we can also copy data. So while I'm archiving to AWS, I can simultaneously create a copy of all of my data, in this case to Google Cloud. This can also be an on-prem target and maybe an AWS Glacier for that secondary copy. So again, I can play around with the age of data here. So maybe I want to move everything that I see. Create a copy of everything that I see. Lastly, I have the ability to confine files. So again, we see a lot of requirements from some of our financial customers who say, I don't necessarily want to delete the data, but I want to make it inaccessible to my users after 7 years or whatever that parameter may be. So I can do that as well. I can actually put these files into a comprise folder. So this will basically be stored in a hidden folder on the source, unbeknownst to the users, still accessible, still there, and still obviously archivable, but simply hidden from view. So that's another feature of the product. Let's quickly take a look at where we set up our targets and sources. So here I'm looking at all of the sources that I've defined on this particular environment. In order to add a new file server, I simply go in here, do a drop down, select the source from which I will be looking at the data. I can also set up a generic source, so I can just go in and say this is just going to be an NFS share. But more often than not, as I said, it's typically an Isilon device or a NetApp device or a Windows file share. So once I select it, I'm simply going to give my credentials and the information about the share. I can also specify the share name, so I can get a little more granular. And then let's move over to the targets. So for my targets, again, I can add an on-prem target. So here's where you're going to see a drop-down of all of the certified targets that we work with today, as well as a generic network-attached storage. So again, if I'm using a lower-tier NAS as a target, I can simply select what protocol I'll be writing to, put the path name, give all the credentials, and create that target. Cloud targets are going to be just as easy. So I'm going to select my target. So I'm selecting Amazon. I'm going to, again, put in my bucket name. And then I'm also have the ability to do something called lifecycle management in AWS. So with that essentially will give me the ability to move data to S3, and then as it ages out, to continually move it down to even lower tiers within AWS. So I can, let's say, age out the data by another 2 years, move it to infrequently accessed, and then give it another year before moving it to Glacier. Comprise will keep track of this so that if that link is touched, the data will come back from the appropriate bucket. So that's setting up sources and targets. For the migration tool, again, you would simply add a migration task. You would select your source and destination. So remember, again, this is not archival. This is simply moving data. Think of it as robocopy on steroids. And the product will actually go out and do a very simple migration, preserving all of the attributes, and do this in multiple iterations and kind of give you the history as it goes. So a very, very easy tool to use as well. And then lastly, I'm just going to jump over to settings. And one of the things I wanted to show you here is that you can control the way the data comes back. So a lot of our customers are very concerned with, once I move data over to, let's say, an S3 target, what happens to that data when someone recalls it? So you do have full control over how we rehydrate that data. So for instance, if somebody changes that file, if they want to move that file back to the source and change it, well, obviously we want to recall that file, right, because it's now a new file. But on read-only files, that may not be the case. So some of the things that you could do is say, I only want this file rehydrated if it's touched a number of times in a number of days. So if that first time was a fluke and a user just accidentally hit that link, I don't necessarily need to rehydrate it back to the source. I may want to wait for a couple of other people to come along and ask for that file, and then maybe at that point it would make sense to bring it back to the source. And we can also do things like group recalls. So if a lot of data has to come back, we enable you to do that as an administrator very, very easily. So once I'm done with my plan and I'm done editing, I can just click this button to activate, and Comprise will actually go ahead and start moving that data, and that orange line will turn to blue. So the very last thing I want to show you here is that edit cost model that I showed you in a slide. This is where you can actually go in and change the parameters of costs that you want us to use for that ROI modeling. So for some of our customers, the storage hardware is the only cost. If they're not doing any kind of backup on their data, they just reset this to 0. You can change this from a cloud target to an on-prem target, and obviously put in the appropriate cost, and then Comprise goes out and recalculates, again, those savings for you. So I know this is quite a bit of information, but I wanted to give you just a quick glance at what the software can do potentially for you. And I will stop here and take questions.
Okay. We've unmuted everybody. If anybody has any questions they'd like to address. Okay. All right, so Lana, I'm going to go ahead and grab the ball back then and move on to the next part of what we're going to do today.
Sure. Did you say you had some questions on?
Yeah, I can either hit a couple of them now, but I'll have them.
Oh, okay. Or we could do everything in the end. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll come through in the end. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and grab the ball back, and we'll open it up in a minute for questions. Let's see. Okay. Okay, excellent. Make sure we're good. We are. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Lana. Excellent information. So before I open it up to the formal Q&A, what I wanted to do was just take a quick second and just tell everybody who we are, remind people who we are. So the organization that we're part of is Vicom Computer Services, and Vicom is a full-service multi-cloud infrastructure provider with over 3 decades of history in helping customers drive business innovation through advanced IT solutions, services, and support offerings. Our domains of expertise include IT infrastructure and multi-cloud solutions, networking, operations and service management, security, staff augmentation, and professional and managed services. Our solutions and offerings can help organizations wherever they sit in regards to the maturity level of their IT environments, their solutions, and their overall needs. So that's a little bit about what we have to offer. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is open it up for some formal Q&A. And Lana, we did have some people that did ask some questions, but let me go ahead and unmute everybody. Give me 1 second. Okay, so again, we'd like to open it up for some formal Q&A if anybody has any. There were a couple questions that were submitted to us on I think you're kind of covered, but I want to bring them across. I also made some notes on some things that I think might be good for people to address. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to bring out? Otherwise, we're going to move on and address the questions that were sent up through chat. Okay, so we had a question through chat here, which says, can you please explain what would happen to the move data if the Comprise license isn't renewed or if the user decides not to keep using Comprise?
Okay,
and
yeah.
Just give me 1 second. Let me mute everybody but yourself so that we don't have the background noise. Go ahead, Lana.
Yeah, so great question. So, you know, one of the big things about doing that native access feature that we have is that the data is fully accessible on the target. So once the data is moved, if it's an S3 target, it is accessible there as well as through the link that was left behind. So if Comprise is taken out of the environment entirely, two things can happen. You can either rehydrate all the data to the source, or you can leave it where it is on the target and simply let your users know that moving forward, that's where the data is going to reside. Now, again, that obviously does add a little complexity because one of the reasons people use Comprise is for that easy file-to-object transfer without having to change anything that the user sees in their world. If you remove Comprise, that data is accessible, or you could rehydrate it back to the source prior to discontinuing use of Comprise.
Okay, excellent. Let me see. Somebody had also asked if you already have a backup solution in place, what will this do? Will that affect my backup? How will it impact things?
Oh, okay. Okay, another really good question. So the backup works with symbolic links just like it would with any other file. So symbolic links, we absolutely recommend that they are backed up. And obviously in the initial stages, as you're doing your backup, if that link is for any reason deleted by the user, it would be restored again through the backup software. But as far as the backup software is concerned, it doesn't follow that link to the target and try to back up the entire file. So it's really going to just be backing up those symbolic links and treating those as files. And that's where the savings on the backup really kicks in. So if you're backing up 500 terabytes of data today and you're paying licensing for that backup, if you reduce that storage footprint by half and you move the data to geo-dispersed object filer or the cloud, that obviously reduces your needs. So now you're backing up 250 terabytes of data instead of 500. And that allows you to go back to that backup software manufacturer and basically reduce your licensing.
Okay, excellent. Let's see, there were a couple of, I think you might have addressed this one, but if there's you talked about how it would be used in a public cloud environment, but how would you access the files on the cloud?
Right. So again, because we're writing as a one-to-one file-to-object, we're supporting what we call native access. Those files are completely accessible through public cloud. So an example, someone like NIH, National Institutes of Health, when they archive their data, they want it to still be accessible not only by them but also by the institutes that they support. So that was one of the big things that they really liked about the product was this ability to make that data accessible. The other archival products that we typically compete with will write in what's called chunking. So they'll break up that into multiple objects. So not only does that make it kind of impossible to go and actually retrieve that file in its native format, it also pushes the cost of storing that data in the cloud because you're now paying for storing 20 objects instead of one. So there's some advantages to doing it in that native access format that we do it in.
Okay. Let me see. The other I think you've addressed those. I made a couple notes on a couple things that I think
Mm-hmm.
just might be, you talked about it a little bit, but the impact of performance in a production environment or production users. Well, you touched on a little, but I think that's an important one to reinforce.
Sure, sure. So not being in that hot data path it was really done by intention, and that's specifically done to not have any impact on the performance of the current NAS and what the users are doing with their quote-unquote hot data. So the way the product works is it goes out and, again, it scans the metadata of all of the files on the NAS, and as it's doing that, it's basically pinging the files. And as those pings potentially get longer because the NAS heats up and is doing other things, Comprise auto-throttles and slows down. So not only do we not impact performance, we're also very sensitive to monitoring the performance and actually quieting down if the performance of the NAS picks up. So it's in no way disruptive to the users or the applications.
Okay. What if you're running snapshots? How does your solution integrate or affect snapshots?
Well, basically the same way that that the backup software. So snapshots are not impacted. They act the same way on symbolic links as they would on any other files. It's just that those snapshots over time will get a lot smaller, which again produces savings on that backup hardware. So for instance, if it's a data domain appliance, for instance, you're now putting smaller and smaller amounts of data on it. So again, that helps reduce that footprint as well as the primary footprint.
Okay. Okay. Well, I have two last-minute things, and then I'll open it up one more time for everybody on the open mic. But in terms of value, when can you start seeing value with a solution such as Comprise?
Almost instantly. So as soon, well, it, again, depends on how you define value, right? So for a lot of our customers, just getting visibility into the data brings a tremendous amount of value because it gives them insights into what they've been storing, how fast the data is growing. But once the archive has been activated and data starts to move, there's immediate savings. So again, and they're tracked through the product with that cost ROI modeling that I had shown you. So the ability to immediately relieve that Tier 1 footprint is instant.
Okay. Excellent. And the last one, just for people listening in, if they wanted to understand what kind of value that Comprise might be for them, how easy is it to do some sort of proof of value? What is needed? Is it hard to do? Is it easy to do? If you could address that.
Sure. Yeah, actually, again, a very simple process because we're stateless, because we don't bring any hardware on-prem. All we really require is a couple of VMs in your environment to get started. So we're very happy to do POCs. We use them to understand your environment as well as have you learn more about the product and how it interacts in your specific conditions. And typical POC for us can be as short as a week because it takes less than an hour to stand up those VMs. We give you the OVAs, you roll them out, you point it to a share, and then almost instantly you have some results. And obviously it could be as extensive as you want it to be. We've done some POCs that lasted months where customers had huge environments with multiple sources, multiple targets, as well as different types of client that are accessing that data. So we welcome POCs. Just contact me. Obviously, contact Vicom, and we'll get on the way with that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Lana. So what I'd like to do, everyone, is open it up for just one quick second. So I've unmuted everyone to see if there's any last-minute questions before we go ahead and wrap up. Any questions of Lana on Comprise or on me on anything on Vicom? Okay. Well, excellent. Okay. So everyone, thank you so much for attending our webinar this morning, and we hope that you found the information useful and, most importantly, relevant to your organization and in what you're doing today. You will receive an email from me or your account manager if you're currently working with Vicom in the next few days. But in the meantime, if you're interested in hearing more about Comprise's solutions or anything else that Vicom does, please feel free to contact me or your Vicom account manager. My contact info is on the screen right here. I will leave it up for a little while, a few minutes, so everybody has the opportunity to see it. So we do want to thank you again for joining us, and please feel free to share your feedback on the webinar with us as well. So thank you, everyone, for considering Vicom, and have a great day.